The morning sun cast long shadows across the tarmac at Bagram Airfield, but Lieutenant Commander Mackenzie Razor Thorne wasn't watching the sunrise. She was studying the fuel gauges on her MH-60M Black Hawk, running her fingers along the aircraft's skin like a surgeon checking for tumors. Something was wrong. The bird had been burning fuel at an unusual rate during yesterday's reconnaissance flight over the Kunar province. And now, with a high-priority SEAL extraction mission scheduled for 800 hours, she couldn't shake the feeling that the helicopter was trying to tell her something. The maintenance crew had signed off on the aircraft at 5:30, declaring it mission-ready, but Razor had learned to trust her instincts more than paperwork. 15 years of flying had taught her that helicopters, like people, had moods. This one felt restless, almost angry. She pressed her ear against the engine cowling, listening for the subtle irregularities that could mean the difference between a successful mission and a catastrophic failure in hostile territory. "Thorne," the voice cut through the morning air like a blade. Master Chief Petty Officer Derek Hammer Kowalski approached with the measured stride of a man who had survived 3 tours in Afghanistan and had little patience for what he perceived as pilot paranoia. "My boys are wheels up in 20 minutes. You better not be having second thoughts about your bird." Razor straightened, her hazel eyes meeting his without flinching. She had heard the whispers around the base, the jokes about the female pilot who spent too much time with her aircraft, who treated routine maintenance like a religious ritual. Some called her obsessive. Others, less charitably, suggested she was overcompensating for being a woman in a male-dominated field. But Razor knew something they didn't. She had never lost a crew, never failed to bring her passengers home, and never ignored the voice that had saved her life more times than she could count. "The fuel consumption patterns from yesterday's flight don't match the mission profile," she said, pulling out her tablet and showing him the data. "We burned through reserves faster than we should have, even accounting for the extended hover time during your reconnaissance phase." Kowalski glanced at the screen with the dismissive look of a man who had been flying combat missions since before she graduated from flight school. "Bird's been cleared by maintenance. We've got targets to hit and a narrow window to do it. My team doesn't have time for your mechanical hunches." But Razor's hunches had a reputation of their own. The insertion point lay 47 kilometers northwest of their current position, nestled in a valley that intelligence reports described as sparsely populated and low threat. The mission briefing had been routine. Extract a high-value target who had been feeding information to coalition forces for the past 8 months. Simple in, simple out. The kind of operation that should have felt comfortable to a crew with their experience. Instead, Razor found herself checking and rechecking her emergency procedures as they lifted off into the crystal-clear Afghan morning. Seated behind her, Kowalski's 8-man SEAL team prepared their equipment with the quiet efficiency that marked elite operators. Their faces were painted in camouflage patterns that would blend seamlessly with the rocky terrain they were about to enter, and their weapons had been cleaned and tested until they functioned like extensions of their bodies. These were professionals at the peak of their game, men who had earned their reputations through blood and sacrifice in some of the world's most dangerous places. Yet Razor noticed something that troubled her: the unusual silence from their target's last communication. The asset, codenamed Nightingale, had missed his scheduled check-in 12 hours ago. Intelligence had attributed the silence to operational security concerns, but Razor had learned to read between the lines of sanitized mission briefs. In her experience, when human intelligence sources went quiet in Afghanistan, it usually meant one of two things: they were either dead or compromised. The Black Hawk's rotors carved through the thin mountain air with rhythmic precision, and Razor found herself falling into the meditative state that came with complex flight operations in hostile territory. Below them, the landscape unfolded like a tactical map come to life, brown and green patches of farmland giving way to increasingly rugged terrain as they approached the target zone. She monitored radio chatter from other aircraft in the area, cross-referenced GPS coordinates with known threats, and maintained the heightened situational awareness that had kept her alive through countless similar missions. 5 minutes to insertion, she announced over the intercom, her voice steady despite the growing unease that had been building since takeoff. The fuel consumption issue hadn't resolved itself. If anything, the discrepancy was becoming more pronounced. At their current burn rate, they would have enough fuel to reach the extraction point and return to base, but with no margin for error. No reserves for unexpected complications or extended hover time. In the unforgiving mathematics of helicopter operations, that translated to a mission profile balanced on the edge of a knife. Kowalski's voice crackled through her headset. "Copy that, Razor. Set us down clean and quiet. We'll have Nightingale secured within 30 minutes." But as they crested the final ridge before the insertion point, Razor saw something that made her blood run cold. The landing zone was perfect, too perfect. The small clearing beside the mud brick compound appeared exactly as described in their intelligence briefings, but the absence of any human activity struck her as profoundly wrong. In a region where children typically appeared at the sound of approaching helicopters, where curious villagers gathered to observe the strange mechanical birds from the sky, the complete stillness felt like a warning written in a language only pilots learn to read. No smoke rising from cooking fires, no livestock in the surrounding fields, no signs of the daily rhythms that characterized even the most remote Afghan settlements. She began her approach, adjusting power and pitch to compensate for the altitude and the Black Hawk's increasingly sluggish response to control inputs. The fuel issue was definitely affecting performance now, though not yet to a degree that would abort the mission. As they descended toward the landing zone, her trained eyes swept the terrain for threats, cataloging potential cover positions, escape routes, and anything that seemed out of place in the tactical picture they had been briefed to expect. The compound itself consisted of 3 main buildings arranged around a central courtyard, with high walls that provided excellent concealment from casual observation. Intelligence had identified it as the home of a provincial government official who had been providing information about Taliban movements in the region. A patriot, they had called him, a man willing to risk his life for the promise of a democratic Afghanistan. But looking at the structure from above, Razor couldn't shake the feeling that they were flying into something that had been carefully prepared for their arrival. "Something's off about this place," she murmured into her microphone, speaking to her co-pilot, Chief Warrant Officer Marcus "Tank" Williams. Tank had been flying with her for 2 years and had learned to trust her instincts even when they contradicted official intelligence assessments. "What are you thinking?" Tank's voice was calm, professional, but she could hear the subtle tension that meant he was also sensing danger. "Too quiet, too clean, and this fuel burn rate." She trailed off, focusing on the delicate task of bringing the Black Hawk to a hover over their designated landing zone. "Keep your eyes open." The helicopter settled onto Afghan soil with barely a whisper, testament to Razor's skill at the controls, but the silence that greeted them felt oppressive rather than peaceful. Through her headset, she could hear Kowalski organizing his team for rapid deployment, their movements precise and rehearsed despite the strange atmosphere that had settled over the mission like morning fog. 30 seconds, Kowalski announced, and his SEALs began their final equipment checks before stepping into whatever waited for them in the compound ahead. That was when Razor made the decision that would change everything. Instead of maintaining standard hover position over the landing zone, she found herself studying the fuel gauges again, and the patterns that had been troubling her since before takeoff suddenly clicked into place with terrible clarity. The excessive fuel consumption wasn't caused by mechanical failure. It was the result of flying at weights significantly higher than normal operating parameters. Someone had been adding unauthorized equipment to her aircraft, equipment that didn't appear on any manifest or loading sheet, equipment that was systematically draining their fuel reserves and compromising their mission capability. The realization hit her like physical blow. They weren't just flying into a potential ambush. They were flying in an aircraft that had been deliberately sabotaged to ensure they couldn't escape if things went wrong. The missing fuel wasn't disappearing because of mechanical failure. It was being consumed at an accelerated rate because someone wanted to make certain that this particular Black Hawk would never make it home from Afghanistan. Her hands moved across the controls with practiced efficiency, but her mind was racing through the implications of what she had discovered. Who had access to her aircraft? Who would benefit from a failed SEAL extraction mission? And most importantly, how much time did they have before the trap closed around them completely? "Tank," she said quietly, her voice carrying the tone that had earned her the call sign Razor, sharp, precise, and capable of cutting through any situation. "We've been set up." Before Tank could respond, the compound below them erupted in a chaos of muzzle flashes and automatic weapons fire. The SEALs, caught in the open as they moved toward their target building, immediately dove for cover behind low stone walls that provided minimal protection against the devastating crossfire that had been prepared for their arrival. The mission had transformed from a routine extraction into a desperate fight for survival in the space of heartbeat, and Razor found herself at the controls of an aircraft that might not have enough fuel to save any of them. The Taliban fighters who emerged from concealed positions around the compound moved with the coordination of a well-rehearsed plan. This wasn't a spontaneous ambush triggered by the unexpected arrival of American forces. It was a carefully orchestrated trap that had been waiting for them with patience and precision. Someone had provided detailed intelligence about their mission timing, their approach route, and their tactical procedures. Someone had ensured that the Black Hawk would be vulnerable, operating at the absolute margins of its performance envelope when the shooting started. Razor's training took over, her hands moving across the controls with the muscle memory developed through thousands of hours of flight time in hostile environments. She pulled pitch and applied power, lifting the Black Hawk away from the immediate danger zone while maintaining position to provide covering fire for the exposed SEAL team. But even as she maneuvered the aircraft with expert precision, she knew that their options were rapidly narrowing to a handful of increasingly desperate choices. "Mayday, mayday, mayday." Tank's voice filled the radio frequencies as he transmitted their emergency call for support. "This is Razor 47, taking heavy fire at grid coordinates." But Razor knew that help was at least 20 minutes away, and based on her fuel calculations, they might not have 20 minutes to wait. The machine gun fire intensified, and she could hear the distinctive sound of bullets striking the Black Hawk's armored hull. The aircraft shuddered under the impact, but continued to respond to her control inputs. For now, she needed to make a decision that would determine whether 8 of America's elite warriors lived or died, and she needed to make it in the next few seconds while under direct enemy fire in an aircraft that was operating on borrowed time. That was when she saw it, a thin column of smoke rising from behind a ridgeline approximately 2 kilometers to the northwest, barely visible against the morning sky. It was coming from a location that didn't appear on any of their intelligence maps, from terrain that had been classified as uninhabited wilderness. But Razor had spent enough time studying Afghan topography to recognize the significance of what she was seeing. The smoke was rising from a concealed position that offered commanding views of multiple approach routes into the valley, a position that would be perfect for coordinating the kind of complex ambush that was currently tearing her mission apart. She made her choice. Instead of following standard procedure and calling for immediate extraction support, instead of attempting to hover over the landing zone while her fuel reserves continued to hemorrhage away, Razor banked the Black Hawk toward the mysterious smoke signature. If someone had orchestrated this trap with such precision, if someone had compromised her aircraft and fed intelligence to the Taliban about their mission, then the answers she needed weren't going to be found in any official briefing or intelligence report. They were going to be found at the source of that smoke, in whatever installation was hidden behind the ridgeline that supposedly didn't exist. "Where the hell are you going?" Kowalski's voice exploded through her headset as he realized that his extraction platform was flying away from the landing zone rather than toward it. His team was pinned down under increasingly accurate fire, their ammunition expenditure rate climbing toward unsustainable levels, and their primary escape route had just abandoned them for reasons he couldn't comprehend. "Trust me," Razor replied, her voice carrying the absolute conviction that had made her one of the most respected helicopter pilots in Special Operations Command. "I know what I'm doing." But as the Black Hawk climbed toward the ridgeline, fuel gauges dropping toward critical levels and enemy fire still echoing from the valley behind them, Razor wasn't entirely certain that she knew anything at all. She was following instincts that had kept her alive through 15 years of military aviation, but she was also flying blind into terrain that might contain any number of additional threats. The only thing she knew for certain was that conventional solutions weren't going to save them from a trap that had been constructed with such devastating effectiveness. The smoke signature grew larger as they approached, and Tank pointed toward a cluster of structures that became visible as they crested the ridge. The installation was much larger than anything that had appeared in their pre-mission intelligence briefings, a complex of buildings and vehicles that suggested a permanent presence rather than a temporary outpost. Most significantly, it was positioned with clear sight lines to the ambush site where Kowalski's team was currently fighting for their lives. "Son of a bitch," Tank breathed into his microphone. "Command didn't know about this place." Razor studied the installation through her aircraft's optics, cataloging details that would have made their mission planners reconsider the entire operation if they had possessed this intelligence 12 hours earlier. The compound contained sophisticated communications equipment, multiple vehicle positions, and what appeared to be a permanent security force. This wasn't a hastily constructed Taliban hideout. It was a command and control facility that had been operating in the region for months or possibly years, completely undetected by coalition intelligence assets. And it was currently coordinating the destruction of her mission. She could see figures moving between the buildings, some of them pointing toward her approaching aircraft, others speaking into handheld radios that were undoubtedly connected to the fighters currently engaging Kowalski's SEALs. The tactical picture was becoming clear with devastating accuracy. This installation had been monitoring coalition communications, tracking mission patterns, and preparing ambushes with intelligence that could only have come from sources within the American command structure. Someone on their side had been feeding information to the enemy, and that someone had ensured that today's mission would end in catastrophe. But they hadn't counted on a pilot who refused to follow standard procedures, when those procedures led directly into carefully prepared kill zones. Razor initiated a tactical approach toward the installation, using terrain features to mask their presence until the last possible moment. The Black Hawk's weapons systems came online automatically, synchronized with her targeting display to provide precision engagement capability against ground targets. She had originally been trained as a transport pilot, but Special Operations Command didn't deploy aircraft into hostile territory without ensuring that they could defend themselves when diplomacy failed. "Razor, what's your fuel state?" Tank's question carried the weight of a man who understood that they were now operating in a realm where every decision carried life-or-death consequences. "Enough to get the job done," she replied, though her fuel gauges suggested otherwise. "But we're going to have to make this count." The installation's security force had spotted their approach and was scrambling to defensive positions, but they were clearly unprepared for a direct assault by a heavily armed American helicopter. Their preparations had focused on ground-based ambushes and coordinated small arms fire, not on defending against close air support assets operating at point-blank range. It was a tactical oversight that Razor intended to exploit with extreme precision. She brought the Black Hawk into a hover at optimal engagement range, her targeting systems locking onto the communications equipment that represented the installation's primary value to enemy operations. One carefully placed rocket strike would eliminate their ability to coordinate attacks against coalition forces, but it would also announce their presence to every hostile element within a 50-kilometer radius. They would have seconds to gather intelligence before the entire region erupted in violence focused on their destruction. "Tank, get ready to document everything you can see," she ordered. "If we don't make it back, someone needs to know what we found here." The first rocket launched with a sound like controlled thunder, streaking toward its target with deadly accuracy. The communications building disappeared in a fireball that sent smoke and debris cascading across the installation's central courtyard. And suddenly, the carefully orchestrated ambush that had been destroying Kowalski's mission began to fall apart as enemy fighters lost contact with their command element. But Razor wasn't finished. As secondary explosions erupted from the destroyed communications facility, she shifted her targeting to a large building that her tactical displays identified as the installation's primary operations center. If this facility had been coordinating attacks against coalition forces for months, then its intelligence archives would contain information that could save American lives across the entire theater of operations. The second rocket struck with devastating precision, and the operations center collapsed in a cascade of concrete and twisted metal. But even as she watched her targets disappear in smoke and flame, Razor was calculating fuel consumption rates and flight times with the desperate mathematics of a pilot who had just committed herself and her crew to a course of action that left no room for error. They had enough fuel to return to the original landing zone and extract Kowalski's team, but they would be operating on fumes during the flight back to base. Any complications, any additional combat maneuvering, any unexpected delays would leave them auto-rotating toward a crash landing in territory now fully alerted to their presence. It was a risk profile that violated every safety protocol she had been taught, but it was also the only option that offered any hope of completing their mission and bringing everyone home alive. "Razor 47, this is Hammer," Kowalski's voice crackled through her headset, confusion and desperation evident despite his attempts to maintain professional composure. "Where the hell did you go? We're taking casualties down here." "On our way back," Razor replied, banking the Black Hawk toward the original landing zone while monitoring her fuel gauges with obsessive attention. "And the cavalry is about to get a lot quieter." As they approached the ambush site, the tactical situation had indeed changed dramatically. The coordinated enemy fire that had pinned down the SEAL team was degenerating into sporadic, uncoordinated shooting as Taliban fighters lost communication with their command element. Without central coordination, the carefully planned ambush was dissolving into a confused firefight that favored the superior training and equipment of Kowalski's operators. But the damage had already been done. 2 SEALs were down with serious wounds, their teammates providing medical care while maintaining defensive positions that were rapidly becoming untenable. The extraction window was closing fast, and every minute they remained on the ground increased the likelihood that enemy reinforcements would arrive to finish what the ambush had started. Razor brought the Black Hawk into a combat landing, her rotor wash clearing dust and debris from the landing zone, while her door gunners provided suppressive fire against remaining enemy positions. The aircraft's engines screamed in protest as she demanded maximum performance from systems that were already operating beyond their designed limits. But the machine responded with the reliability that had made the Black Hawk the backbone of American Special Operations aviation. "Move, move, move." Kowalski's voice cut through the noise of rotor blades and gunfire as his team began their fighting withdrawal toward the extraction aircraft. The wounded SEALs were carried by their teammates with the fierce loyalty that defined elite military units, no one left behind regardless of the personal cost to those who remained mobile. Razor held the hover with rock-steady precision despite the continuing enemy fire and the aircraft's increasingly sluggish response to control inputs. Fuel warnings were illuminating her instrument panel like Christmas lights, but she maintained position until every member of Kowalski's team was safely aboard her aircraft. Only then did she pull pitch and apply power for the most critical flight of her career, a race against fuel exhaustion that would determine whether 8 American warriors lived to fight another day. The flight back to Bagram Airfield stretched ahead of them like a gauntlet, 47 kilometers of hostile territory that had to be covered in an aircraft operating on vapor fumes and determination. But as they climbed away from the ambush site, Razor allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. They had discovered a major enemy installation that intelligence had missed completely, eliminated a command and control facility that had been coordinating attacks against coalition forces, and extracted a SEAL team that had been moments away from being overrun. Most importantly, they had survived a trap that had been designed to ensure their destruction, survived it through a combination of skill, instinct, and the kind of tactical decision-making that separated competent pilots from legendary ones. The fuel gauges continued their relentless countdown toward empty, but Razor had calculated their consumption rate with mathematical precision. They would make it back to base with less than 5 minutes of fuel remaining, a margin that would have horrified safety inspectors, but was more than adequate for a pilot who had learned to extract maximum performance from every system under her control. Bagram Tower, this is Razor 47 requesting priority landing, tank transmitted as they approached the airfield. We have wounded personnel aboard and are declaring a fuel emergency. The response was immediate. Razor 47, you are cleared direct approach runway 27. Emergency crews are standing by. As the Black Hawk settled onto the familiar tarmac at Bagram Airfield, fuel gauges reading empty and engines winding down with the distinctive whine of turbines that had given everything they had to give, Razor finally allowed herself to acknowledge the magnitude of what they had accomplished. They had not only survived an elaborate trap, but had turned it into a tactical victory that would reverberate throughout the entire Afghan theater of operations. But more than that, they had proven something that would reshape perceptions and challenge assumptions that had persisted throughout her career. The maintenance crews who swarmed over her aircraft would find evidence of the sabotage that had nearly doomed their mission, evidence that would trigger investigations reaching into the highest levels of coalition command structure. The intelligence gathered from the destroyed enemy installation would lead to the capture of Taliban commanders who had been operating with impunity for months. And the successful extraction of Kowalski's team would ensure that 8 of America's elite warriors would continue their service to the nation that had sent them into harm's way. As Razor shut down her engines and began her post-flight inspection, she reflected on the events that had transformed what should have been a routine extraction into a mission that would be studied in military academies for decades to come. She had made decisions that violated standard operating procedures, had committed her aircraft and crew to courses of action that existed far outside approved doctrine, and had succeeded through a combination of skill and intuition that couldn't be taught in any classroom. The SEALs who filed past her as they left the aircraft offered words of gratitude that carried weight far beyond simple courtesy. These were warriors who had seen her perform under pressure that would have broken lesser pilots, who had witnessed her make decisions that saved their lives when conventional wisdom would have led to their destruction. The respect in their voices was earned through shared danger and proven competence, not granted as a concession to political correctness or social advancement. Master Chief Kowalski was the last to leave the aircraft, and he paused beside her pilot's seat with an expression that mixed exhaustion with something approaching awe. "Thorne," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology, and a debt I can never repay." Razor met his gaze steadily, seeing recognition where there had once been dismissal, respect where there had once been skepticism. "Just doing my job, Master Chief, same as you." But they both knew it had been much more than that. In the space of a single mission, she had demonstrated capabilities that transcended gender, rank, or any of the artificial boundaries that military organizations sometimes imposed on their members. She had proven herself not as a female pilot seeking acceptance in a male-dominated profession, but as a warrior whose skills and judgment could be trusted when everything hung in the balance. The investigation that followed would uncover a network of corruption and betrayal that reached into the coalition command structure, revealing how enemy forces had gained access to operational planning and mission details that should have been impossible to compromise. Several officers would face courts-martial, intelligence procedures would be completely overhauled, and security protocols would be tightened to prevent similar breaches in the future. But the most significant change would be in the way that Razor was perceived by her peers and superiors. The whispers about mechanical obsessions and excessive caution were replaced by discussions of tactical brilliance and exceptional airmanship. The jokes about female pilots were silenced by the undeniable evidence of combat performance that exceeded any reasonable standard of excellence. Her decision to investigate the mysterious smoke signature, instead of following standard extraction procedures, was analyzed and praised as an example of adaptive thinking under pressure. Her fuel management during the extended mission was studied as a masterclass in resource optimization under extreme conditions. And her precision engagement of the enemy command facility was incorporated into training scenarios as an example of how air assets could be employed to maximum tactical advantage. Within 6 months, Razor would be promoted to commander and assigned to lead a squadron of her own, her reputation preceding her to assignments where her judgment and leadership would shape the next generation of military aviators. The call sign that had once seemed to emphasize her sharp edges would come to represent the precision and effectiveness that defined her approach to every aspect of military service. But on that morning at Bagram Airfield, as she completed her post-flight inspection and prepared to brief intelligence officers on what they had discovered, Razor was focused on simpler concerns. Her aircraft had performed magnificently despite the sabotage attempts. Her crew had functioned with seamless professionalism under extreme pressure, and 8 American warriors were alive because she had trusted her instincts when conventional wisdom pointed toward disaster. The fuel gauges read empty, but they had made it home. The engines showed signs of stress from prolonged operation at maximum power settings, but they had delivered the performance when it mattered most. And somewhere in the mountains of Afghanistan, a Taliban command facility lay in ruins because a pilot had refused to accept that things were exactly as they appeared to be. As the sun climbed higher over the Afghan landscape, casting long shadows across the airfield where coalition forces prepared for another day of operations against determined enemies, Razor began planning her next mission. There would be other extractions, other insertions, other flights into hostile territory where American lives would depend on her skill and judgment. But there would never be another mission quite like this one. Never another moment when a single decision would so completely transform perceptions and challenge assumptions that had seemed carved in stone. She had proven that competence transcended every artificial boundary, that excellence recognized no limitations based on gender or expectation, and that when everything hung in the balance, the only thing that mattered was the ability to deliver results when failure was not an option. The debriefing would take hours, the investigation would take months, and the full implications of what they had discovered would take years to completely understand. But as Razor walked away from her aircraft, she carried with her the satisfaction of knowing that she had not only met every challenge that had been placed before her, but had exceeded every expectation that others had dared to hold. In the unforgiving crucible of combat aviation, where mistakes were measured in lives lost and success was defined by missions completed, she had established herself as a pilot whose capabilities could be trusted without reservation or qualification. And in doing so, she had opened doors for others who would follow, proving that excellence was not limited by anything except the courage to pursue it and the skill to achieve it when everything mattered most.